Greetings. I'm Carolyn Waters, head librarian at the New York Society Library, one of the first libraries in the country and the oldest here in New York City. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Black Literature Matters, a program of dramatic readings of works written by African Americans over the centuries. Tonight's program will focus on the 1700s. According to historian Leslie Harris, in 1613, Jan Rodriguez, a sailor of African descent, settled in what is now Manhattan. He established a trading post and ran a thriving business. Despite early Black presence, in 1754, when the New York Society Library opened its doors, slavery was embedded in the economy and society. The city's expansion was the work of the enslaved, almost 20% of the population. With a population of about 18,000, New York City was just surpassing Boston to become the second largest port and metropolis in the American colonies after Philadelphia. Manhattan meant Lower Manhattan. A huge log wall starting at Chambers Street defended the northern perimeter of the city from its original inhabitants, Lenape Native Americans. Where the library is now located on East 79th Street was a rural setting. The 1700s marked a high point in the slave trade. Each year, 85,000 Africans were transported to the New World, and in parts of the Americas, enslaved Blacks far outnumbered free persons. As historian Seymour Drescher wrote, "Freedom, not slavery, was the peculiar institution." At the library's founding, few people saw a contradiction between freedom for whites and bondage for Blacks. However, in the last quarter of the 1700s, with the widespread availability of books and newspapers, anti-slavery sentiment grew as the writings of individuals and religious groups reached a wider public. The first membership libraries, like the New York Society Library, contributed to this expanded readership. It was our library founders' belief that an institution that anyone could join and that offered a wide range of books would be very useful as well as ornamental to the city. Our library's collection, in particular, benefited from the trustees selecting leading books of the day across a wide spectrum, though interestingly, they did not rely just upon their own judgment, but sending additional funds to their English bookseller so that he could select, and I quote, "such other modern authors as he may judge most suitable for a public library and have obtained an established reputation among the learned." Also during this time, the most significant development occurred: the publication of at least 10 narratives by enslaved Blacks who described their African homeland, their capture and passage to the New World, and their lives in bondage. In this same period, the poetry of 2 enslaved writers was published. Joining me in discussing these first African-American writers is Dr. Farah Griffin from our sister institution, Columbia University, King's College, which was also founded in 1754. Dr. Griffin is the inaugural chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department at Columbia, where she is also professor of English and comparative literature. Welcome, Farah.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Good evening. Almost 12.5 million African captives were brought from Africa to the Americas. Several of them left behind firsthand accounts of their experiences. These gave birth to a genre of writing, the slave narrative, a form that would exert profound influence on American literature. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, people of African descent produced more works of writing than any group of enslaved people ever in history. The earliest text borrowed from the spiritual narratives, which documented the conversion of the protagonist to Christianity, and it also borrowed from captivity narratives, which were a genre that focused on people who had been captured by Native Americans. The earliest slave narratives did not explicitly condemn the institution of slavery. Instead, they sought to demonstrate the humanity of the enslaved through his literacy and commitment to the principles of both Christianity and the Enlightenment. But as the abolitionist movements grew in the United States and North America and in England, narratives written by former or fugitive slaves became militantly anti-slavery in tone. Often, the slave narratives had prefaces written by prominent whites to attest to the authenticity of the writer's tale, and others were actually dictated to white amanuenses who would write down the stories that they told. Let's begin with James Gronniosaw. His autobiography, a narrative of the most remarkable particulars in the life of James Albert Ukasaw Gronniosaw, an African prince, as related by himself, was first published in England in 1772 and is the first of what we come to know of as the slave narratives. He spent his early life in what today is northwestern Nigeria, when at the age of 15, around 1720, he was sold for, quote, 2 yards of check, end quote, 2 yards of check fabric. He was sold to a Dutch slaver on the Gold Coast, or what is today's Ghana.
I was born in the city of Bornu. My mother was the eldest daughter of the reigning king there. I was the youngest of 6 children, and particularly loved by my mother, and my grandfather almost doted on me. There came a merchant from the Gold Coast, the 3rd city in Guinea. He traded with the inhabitants of our country in ivory and etc., and he took great notice of my unhappy situation and inquired into the cause. He expressed vast concern for me and said, if my parents would part with me for a little while and let him take me home with him, it would be of more service to me than anything they could do for me. He told me that if I would go with him, I should see houses with wings to them walk upon the water, and should also see the white folks, and that he had many sons of my age, which should be my companions. And he added to all this, that he would bring me safe back again soon. Well, I was highly pleased with the account of this strange place and was very desirous of going. I seemed sensible of a secret impulse upon my mind, which I could not resist, that seemed to tell me I must go. When my dear mother saw that I was willing to leave them, she spoke to my father and grandfather and the rest of my relations, who all agreed that I should accompany the merchant to the Gold Coast. I cannot recollect how long we were in going from Bornu to the Gold Coast, but as there is no shipping nearer to Bornu than that city, it was tedious in traveling so far by land, being upward of 1,000 miles. I was heartily rejoiced when we arrived at the end of our journey. I now vainly imagined that all my troubles and inquietudes would terminate here. But could I have looked into futurity, I should have perceived that I had much more to suffer than I had before experienced, and that they had as yet but barely commenced. In the evening of the same day, 2 of the merchant's sons, boys about my own age, came running to me and told me that the next day I was to die, for the king intended to behead me. Well, I replied that I was sure it could not be true, for that I came there to play with them and to see houses, walk upon the water with wings to them, and the white folks. But I was soon informed that their king imagined that I was sent by my father as a spy, and would make such discoveries at my return home that would enable them to make war with the greater advantage to ourselves. And for these reasons, he had resolved I should never return to my native country. The morning I was to die, I was washed, and all my gold ornaments made bright and shining, and then carried to the place where the king was to behead me himself, as is the custom of the place. He was seated upon a throne at the top of an exceeding large yard or court, I guess to be about 300 paces. I was conducted by my friend, the merchant, about halfway up, then he durst proceed no further. I went up to the king alone. I went with an undaunted courage, and it pleased God to melt the heart of the king, who sat with his scimitar in his hand, ready to behead me. Yet, being himself so affected, he dropped it out of his hand, and took me upon his knee and wept over me. I put my right hand round his neck and pressed him to my heart. He set me down and blessed me, and added that he would not kill me, and that I should not go home, but be sold for a slave. So then I was conducted back again to the merchant's house. A few days after, a Dutch ship came into the harbor, and they carried me on board in hopes that the captain would purchase me. As they went, I heard them agree that if they could not sell me, then they would throw me overboard. I was in extreme agonies when I heard this. I was exceedingly seasick at first, but when I became more accustomed to the sea, it wore off. My master's ship was bound for Barbados. When we came there, he thought fit to speak of me to several gentlemen of his acquaintance, and one of them expressed a particular desire to see me. He had a great mind to buy me, but the captain could not immediately be prevailed on to part with me. But, however, as the gentleman seemed very solicitous, he at length let me go, and I was sold for $50, 4 66 pieces in English. My new master's name was Van Horn, a young gentleman. His home was in New England, in the city of New York, to which place he took me with him.
His fate as a free man in England, with the support of Wesleyan Methodist abolitionists, ensured publication of his narrative in England. At the end of his narrative, Gronniosaw presented himself as a fully assimilated Englishman. The work was greatly influenced by Puritan writers like John Bunyan, and therefore it was a spiritual narrative that elaborated upon the themes of sin and conversion, more than an anti-slavery narrative. A popular work, Gronniosa's narrative was published in several editions and influenced later writers of narratives, including Equiano, who mentioned him in his 1789 work.
According to his narrative, Olaudah Equiano, 1745-1797, spent his first years in the Igbo region of the Kingdom of Benin, today southern Nigeria. Equiano's experience in slavery was quite unlike that of Gronniosaw. He was sold to a sea captain in Virginia, with whom he traveled widely. He received some education before he purchased his own freedom and settled in England. Shortly after his arrival, Equiano became an active abolitionist. His autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African, was published in 1789 as a 2-volume work. It went through 1 American and 8 British editions during his lifetime. His journey of advancement and his experiences as a Black immigrant caused a sensation when it was published. The book fueled a growing anti-slavery movement in Great Britain, Europe, and the New World. His account surprised many with the quality of its imagery, description, and literary quality. The New York Society Library acquired Equiano's memoir in 1791, 2 years after it was published in England. In the next 10 years, the book appeared in the library's charging ledgers 9 times. The library members who read Equiano's book included merchants, an attorney, a shipmaster, several clergymen. One, William Lynn, was the 2nd president of Rutgers University and the 1st chaplain in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was later to become a trustee of the New York Society Library.
That part of Africa known by the name of Guinea, to which the trade for slaves is carried on, extends along the coast above 3,400 miles, from the Senegal to Angola, and includes a variety of kingdoms. Of these, the most considerable is the Kingdom of Benin, both as to extent and wealth, the richness and cultivation of the soil, the power of its king, and the number and warlike disposition of its inhabitants. This kingdom is divided into many provinces or districts, in one of the most remote and fertile of which, called Igbo, I was born, in the year 1745, in a charming, fruitful vale named Isaka. The distance of this province from the capital of Benin and the sea coast must be very considerable, for I had never heard of white men or Europeans, nor of the sea. And our subjection to the king of Benin was little more than nominal, for every transaction of the government, as far as my slender observation extended, was conducted by the chiefs or elders of the place. My father was one of those elders or chiefs as I have spoken of, and was styled Imbrinche, a term, as I remember, importing the highest distinction and signifying in our language a mark of grandeur. This mark is conferred on the person entitled to it by cutting the skin above the top of the forehead and drawing it down to the eyebrows, and while it is in this situation, applying a warm hand and rubbing it until it shrinks up into a thick wheal across the lower part of the forehead. Most of the judges and senators were thus marked. My father had long borne it. I had seen it conferred on one of my brothers, and I was also destined to receive it by my parents. Those Imbrinche, or chief men, decided disputes and punished crimes, for which purpose they also assembled together. The proceedings were generally short, and in most cases the law of retaliation prevailed. One day, when all our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, two men and a woman got over our walls and in a moment seized upon us. And without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Now, for a long time we had kept to the woods, but at last we came into a road which I believed I knew. I had now some hopes of being delivered, for we had advanced but a little way before I discovered some people at a distance, on which I began to cry out for their assistance. But my cries had no other effect than to make them tie me faster and stop my mouth. And then they put me into a large sack. They also stopped my sister's mouth and tied her hands. And in this manner we proceeded till we were out of sight of these people. The next day proved a day of greater sorrow than I had yet experienced, for my sister and I were then separated, while we lay clasped in each other's arms. It was in vain that we besought them not to part us. She was torn from me and immediately carried away, while I was left in a state of distraction not to be described. I cried and grieved continually, and for several days I did not eat anything but what they forced into my mouth. The first object was saluted. My eyes, when I arrived on the coast, was the sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I was sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits and that they were going to kill me. When I looked round the ship too, and saw a large furnace or copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted of my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I felt motionless on the deck and fainted. When I recovered, a little, I found some black people about me. I asked them if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and long hair. They told me I was not, and one of the crew brought me a small portion of spirituous liquor in a wine glass. But being afraid of him, I would not take it out of his hand. One of the blacks therefore took it from him and gave it to me, and I took a little down my palate, which, instead of reviving me as they thought it would, threw me into the greatest consternation at the strange feeling it produced, having never tasted any such liquor before. Soon after this, the blacks who brought me on board went off and left me abandoned to despair. I now saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country, or even the least glimpse of hope of gaining the shore, which I now considered as friendly. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life. So that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. But soon, to my grief, two of the white men offered me eatables. And on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hand and laid me across, I think, the windlass and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared the element the first time I saw it. Yet nevertheless, could I have got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely, who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. In a little time after, amongst the poor chained men, I found some of my own nation. They gave me to understand we were to be carried to these white people's country to work for them. I was soon reduced so low here that it was thought necessary to keep me almost always on deck. And from my extreme youth, I was not put in fetters. In this situation, I expected every hour to share the fate of my companions. Often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much more happy than myself. Every circumstance I met with served only to render my state more painful and heighten my apprehensions and my opinion of the cruelty of the whites. One day, they had taken a number of fishes, and when they had killed and satisfied themselves with as many as they thought fit, to our astonishment who were on the deck, rather than give any of them to us to eat as we expected, they tossed the remaining fish into the sea again, although we begged and prayed for some as well as we could, but in vain. And one day, when we had smooth sea and moderate wind, two of my wearied countrymen who were chained together, I was near them at the time, preferred death to such a life of misery, somehow made through the nettings and jumped into the sea. Immediately, another quite dejected fellow who, on account of his illness, was suffered to be out of irons, also followed their example. And I believe many more would very soon have done the same, if they had not been prevented by the ship's crew, who were instantly alarmed. At last, we came in sight of the island of Barbados, at which the whites on board gave a great shout and made many signs of joy to us. We did not know what to think of this, but as the vessel drew nearer, we plainly saw the harbor and other ships of different kinds and sizes, and we soon anchored amongst them off Bridgetown. Many merchants and planters now came on board, though it was in the evening. They put us in separate parcels and examined us attentively. They also made us jump and pointed to the land, signifying we were to go there. We thought by this we should be eaten by these ugly men, as they appeared to us, and when soon after we were all put down under the deck again, there was such dread and trembling among us, and nothing but bitter cries to be heard all the night from these apprehensions, insomuch that at last the white people would get some old slaves from the land to pacify us. They told us we were not to be eaten, but to work, and were soon to go on land, where we should see many of our own, our own country people. This report eased as much. And sure enough, soon after we were landed, there came to us Africans of all languages. We were conducted immediately to the merchant's yard, where we were all pent up together like so many sheep in a fold, without regard to sex or age. As every object was new to me, everything I saw filled me with surprise. We were not many days in the merchant's custody before we were sold after their usual manner, which is this. On a signal given as the beat of a drum, the buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined, and make choice of that parcel that they like best. The noise and clamor with which this is attended and the eagerness visible in the countenance of the buyers serve not a little to increase the apprehensions of the terrified Africans, who may well be supposed to consider them as the ministers of that destruction to which they think themselves devoted. In this manner, without scruple, are relations and friends separated, most of them never to see each other again. I remember in the vessel in which I was brought over, in the men's apartment, there were several brothers who, in the sale, were sold in different lots, and it was very moving on this occasion to see and hear their cries at parting. Why are parents to those to lose their children, brothers, their sisters or husbands, their wives? Surely, this is a new refinement in cruelty, which, while it has no advantage to atone for it, thus aggravates distress and adds fresh horrors even to the wretchedness of slavery.
By the time he published his narrative, Equiano was a prominent abolitionist leader and public figure. As the British Parliament began debating the slave trade in 1782, Equiano emerged as an important voice in the anti-slavery movement. He wrote his 2-volume autobiography with the explicit goal of swaying public opinion against the transnational slave trade. Within 5 years of its publication, the narrative went through 8 editions. It would be published in Russian, Dutch, and German. It was one of the first written accounts we have of the Middle Passage from the vantage point of the enslaved. In addition, it's one of the first efforts by a writer of African descent not only to describe the experiences of slavery and freedom, but to do so in a way that speaks directly to the tradition of Western literature. In recent years, the veracity of Equiano's narrative has been called into question, sparking a lively new scholarly debate. On the one hand, his biographer, Vincent Coretta, located a baptismal record and a naval muster roll where Equiano's birthplace is listed as South Carolina. But another scholar, Paul E. Lovejoy, has found evidence to support Equiano's claim to his West African birth. Nonetheless, no one disputes that Equiano is the sole author of his narrative, and nor do we dispute the remarkable narrative's literary value. Largely due to the sales of his books and the subscription method through which he sold it, Equiano, at the time of his death, was one of the wealthiest men of African descent in England.
Like the two previous narratives, this one by Venture Smith, birth name Rotier Furrow, 1729 to 1805, began in West Africa and included his capture at 6 years of age and transport to the Americas as a slave. But here their experiences as slaves and free men diverged. Gronniosaw and Equiano ended up living and finding freedom in England, where their narratives were published and supported by early abolitionist groups. Venture Smith, however, was bought by Robinson Mumford and taken to live on Fisher's Island in Long Island Sound. He lived in and around Long Island and Connecticut for the rest of his life. His efforts at freedom were the result of his own enduring and persistent industry, despite reverses at every turn. At 36, he bought his freedom from Colonel Oliver Smith, whose surname he took. But Venture Smith only had this to say.
I had already been sold 3 different times, made considerable money with seemingly nothing to derive it from, been cheated out of a large sum of money much by misfortunes, and paid an enormous sum for my freedom.
Eventually, he purchased freedom for the rest of his family and 130 acres of land in Haddam Neck, Connecticut, making a living fishing, farming, whaling, and trading in and around the area. In 1798, he dictated his autobiography, a narrative of the life and adventures of Venture, a native of Africa, but resident above 60 years in the United States of America, related by himself. Printed by Charles Holt in the New London offices of his newspaper, The Bee, the narrative went unnoticed and was never reprinted in Smith's lifetime. Nevertheless, the account is dramatic in its matter-of-fact rendering of immense strivings and obstacles.
Since my residence at Haddam Neck, I have owned of boats, canoes, and sailed vessels, not less than 20. These I mostly employed in the fishing and trafficking business, and in these occupations I have been cheated out of considerable money by people whom I traded, with taking advantage of my ignorance of numbers. About 12 years ago, I hired a whale boat and 4 black men and proceeded to Long Island after a load of round clams. Having arrived there, I first purchased of James Webb, son of Orange Webb, 660 clams, and afterwards, with the help of my men, finished loading my boat. Well, the same evening, however, this Webb stole my boat and went in her to Connecticut River and sold her cargo for his own benefit. I thereupon pursued him, and at length, after an additional expense of 9 crowns, recovered the boat. But for the proceeds of her cargo, I never could obtain any compensation. 4 years after, I met with another loss, far superior to this in value, and I think by no less wicked means. Being going to New London with a grandchild, I took passage in an Indian's boat and went there with him. Now, on our return, the Indian took on board 2 hogsheads of molasses, one of which belonged to Captain Elisha Hart of Saybrook, to be delivered on his wharf. When we arrived there, and while I was gone, at the request of the Indian to inform Captain Hart of his arrival and receive the freight for him, 1 hogshead of the molasses had been lost overboard by the people in attempting to land it on the wharf. Now, although I was absent at the time and had no concern whatsoever in the business, as was known to a number of respectable witnesses, I was nevertheless prosecuted by the conscientious gentleman, the Indian not being able to pay for it, and obliged to pay upwards of 10 pounds lawful money, with all the cost of court. I applied to several gentlemen for counsel in this affair, and they advised me, as my adversary was rich, and threatened to carry the matter from court to court till it would cost me more than the first damages would be to pay for the sum and submit to the injury, which I accordingly did. and he has often since insultingly taunted me with my unmerited misfortune. Such a proceeding as this, committed on a defenseless stranger, almost worn out in the hard service of the world, without any foundation in reason or justice, whatever it may be called in a Christian land, would in my native country have been branded as a crime equal to highway robbery. But Captain Hart was a white gentleman, and I was a poor African. Therefore, it was right and good enough for the black dog. Well, I am now 69 years old. Though once straight and tall, measuring without shoes 6 feet 1 inch and a half, and every way well proportioned, I am now bowed down with age and hardship. My strength, which was once equal, if not superior to any man whom I have ever seen, is now enfeebled so that life is a burden, and it is with fatigue that I can walk a couple of miles, stooping over my staff. Other griefs are still behind, on account of which some aged people, at least, will pity me. My eyesight had gradually failed, till I am almost blind, and whenever I go abroad, one of my grandchildren must direct my way. Besides, for many years, I have been much pained and troubled with an ulcer on one of my legs. But amidst all my griefs and pains, I have many consolations. Meg, the wife of my youth, whom I married for love and bought with my money, is still alive. My freedom is a privilege which nothing else can equal, notwithstanding all the losses I have suffered by fire, by the injustice of knaves, by more than 100 acres of land, by the cruelty and oppression of false-hearted friends, and the perfidy of my own countrymen whom I have assisted and redeemed from bondage. I am now possessed of more than 100 acres of land and 3 habitable dwelling houses. It gives me joy to think that I have and that I deserve so good a character, especially for truth and integrity. While I am now looking to the grave as my home, my joy for this world would be full if my children, Cuff, for whom I paid $200 when a boy, and Solomon, who was born soon after I purchased his mother, if Cuff and Solomon, oh, that they had walked in the way of their father. But a father's lips are closed in silence and in grief. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity.
Venture Smith died in September 1805. His narrative was dictated to a man later identified as Elisha Niles. Niles referred to Smith as an untutored African slave, destitute of all education. The narrative, however, reveals much, much more. A man whose sheer tenacity and will against all odds are the driving forces of his remarkable story. His memory of Africa are among the most sustained we have from early African writers in English, and his documentation of the ongoing injustice he experiences in America makes his account one of the earliest indictments of the nation's racism and the hypocrisy of its claims to meritocracy. Smith's harsh life experiences were entirely in Connecticut and on Long Island, thus testifying to the brutality of slavery in the North. It is likely that his experience is far closer to many anonymous enslaved people than is that of Equiano. Smith's autobiography was the first published slave narrative in the United States. Unlike the well-publicized narratives of Equiano and Gronniosaw, Smith never had the support of abolitionists, nor was his narrative republished in his lifetime. Now, I want to introduce you to selections from the first African American to publish a book of poetry, Phyllis Wheatley, thought to have been born around 1753 and died in 1784. She was the first to achieve international reputation as a writer. Born in the Senegambia region of West Africa and enslaved in America at around 7 years of age, Wheatley had only 4 years of exposure to the English language when she began writing poetry. Her first poem appeared in a Newport, Rhode Island newspaper in 1765 when she was 12. At 17, Phyllis wrote an elegy on the death of the Reverend George Whitefield, a Methodist evangelist. After writing other well-received elegies, Phyllis sailed to England in the spring of 1773 to oversee the publication of a volume of poetry, poems on various subjects, religious and moral, by Phillis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston in New England. Soon after her arrival home, the 23-year-old Wheatley was emancipated.
"'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train."
Many 20th century artists and critics, especially those of the Black Arts movement in the 1960s, expressed disdain for Wheatley's early verse because she called Africa a pagan land and actually expressed gratitude to slavery for introducing her to Christianity. Subsequent readers, however, assert that Wheatley appears to accept the absurdity of these claims, which are shared by her white audience. She does this so she can speak to them with authority as an equal who admonishes them. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. Furthermore, as Henry Louis Gates Jr. reminds us in his 2010 book, The Trials of Phyllis Wheatley, America's First Black Poet and Her Encounters with the Founding Fathers, Wheatley also wrote lesser-known poems that both celebrated the colonies while challenging slavery. One of the most powerful is To the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth. The persona of this poem is grateful to the second Earl of Dartmouth, who is newly appointed Secretary of State for the colonies. She's grateful to him because of his sympathy to the concerns of the colonists. Hail, happy day, when smiling like the morn, fair freedom rose New England to adorn. She sings the praises of freedom, using metaphors of slavery to describe the condition of the colonies in relation to England. However, mid-poem, she says,
"Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung? Whence flow these wishes for the common good? By feeling hearts alone best understood. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest? What sorrows labor in my parents' breast? Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his baby beloved. Such my case. And can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway?
here, her authority is based not on her conversion to Christianity, but instead on her status as an enslaved African. Here, Africa is no longer a pagan land, but Afrique's fancied, happy seat from which she was snatched. The enslaved poet here has moral authority and desires not only her own freedom, but also that of those who enslave her. She doesn't want them to experience the tyranny that they have exposed and imposed on Black people.
Many 20th and 21st century poets, among them June Jordan, Edward Hirsch, and Robert Hayden, trace their lineage back to Wheatley. They see her work as an act of courage that has given and continues to feed their own. Robert Hayden's A Letter from Phyllis Wheatley, London, 1773, repeats the lines, "I begin with Phyllis Wheatley, I begin with Phyllis Wheatley, I begin with Phyllis Wheatley." June Jordan notes Wheatley's singing for liberty, singing against the tyrannical, repeatedly avid in her trusting support of the American Revolution. She was repeatedly lifting witness to the righteous and the kindly factors of her days. This was no ordinary teenaged poet, male or female, Black or white. Indeed, the insistently concrete content of her tribute to the revolutionaries who would forge America, an independent nation state, indeed the specific daily substance of her poetry, establishes Phyllis Wheatley as the first decidedly American poet on this continent, Black or white, male or female. Jordan cites Wheatley's 2SM, a young African painter, on seeing his works as an illustration in sharp contrast to the claim that she failed to contribute to the well-being of Black people in her time. Here, Wheatley's recognition of a Black man's artistic gifts is a major contribution to a sense of value and worth not limited to slave status. It was and still is a reminder that one's gifts cannot be the property of anyone other than the gifted.
To show the laboring bosom's deep intent and thought in living characters to paint. When first thy pencil did those beauties give, and breathing figures learnt from thee to live, oh, how did those prospects give my soul delight? A new creation rushing on my sight. Still, wondrous youth, each noble path pursue, on deathless glories fix thine ardent view. Still, may the painters and the poets fire to aid thy pencil and thy verse conspire. And many the charms of each seraphic theme conduct thy footsteps to immortal fame.
Exhorted, remember that the poet so generously addressing the wondrous youth is no older than 18 herself. And this years before the American Revolution, and how many years before the 1960s. This is the first Black poet of America addressing her brother artist, an enslaved African American, addressing him not as so-and-so's boy, but as Scipio Moorhead, a young African painter. No single writer has contributed more to the founding of African American literature. Wheatley set the foundation for the abolitionist writers who would follow her. The scholar Sandra O'Neill, writing in the Journal of Negro Education, noted that Wheatley was a strong force among the abolitionist writers of her day, and that, quote, through her use of biblical imagery, she incorporated anti-slavery statements in her work within the confines of her era and her position as a slave. She deserves her place of honor among our earliest Black writers.
Wheatley's poetry is a crucial contribution to the ongoing dialogue on race and culture, as are the poetry and prose of Jupiter Hammond, the last writer to be discussed in tonight's program on the 1700s.
An excerpt from an address to Miss Phyllis Wheatley. Come, dear Phyllis, be advised to drink Samaria's flood. There nothing is that shall suffice but Christ's redeeming blood.
Written 18 years after his first poem, Hammond's An Evening Thought, Salvation by Christ with Penitential Cries, was published in a broadside in 1761. These lines reveal the strong influence of the Great Awakening, a major religious revival.
An excerpt from An Evening Thought, Salvation by Christ with Penitential Cries. Salvation comes by Jesus Christ alone, the only Son of God. Redemption now to everyone that love his holy word.
Educated along with the children of the family to whom he was enslaved, Jupiter Hammond became, like them, a devout Christian well-versed in the Bible. Following the death in 1763 of the family's patriarch, and although still enslaved son, Hammond began attending Revolutionary War and abolitionist meetings. His address to the Negroes of the state of New York, delivered in 1787 to members of the African Society of New York, shines a light on Hammond's gifts as an orator.
Respecting obedience to masters. Now, whether it is right and lawful in the sight of God for them to make slaves of us or not, I am certain that while we are slaves, it is our duty to obey our masters in all their lawful commands and mind them unless we are bid to do that which we know to be sin or forbidden in God's word. Now, the Apostle Paul says, servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness in your heart as unto Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ doing the will of God from the heart, with God or with good will doing service to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever thing a man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. Here is a plain command of God for us to obey our masters. Now, it may seem hard for us, if we think our masters wrong in holding us slaves, to obey in all things, but who of us dare dispute with God? He has commanded us to obey, and we ought to do it cheerfully and freely. This should be done by us, not only because God commands, but because our own peace and comfort depend upon it. As we depend upon our masters for what we eat and drink and wear, and for all our comfortable things in this world, we cannot be happy unless we please them.
We applaud Jupiter Hammond speaking out against slavery, not only in the newly discovered poem, but in the poet's thoughts expressed in the address. Here he asserted that slavery was not created and favored by God, but rather a man-made institution. Until 2013, when an unpublished poem by Jupiter Hammond dated 1786 was discovered in Yale's Beinecke Library archives, he was the lesser known of the two enslaved poets. Until then, the last Hammond poem to be uncovered was in 1915 in the holdings of the New York Historical Society. The 2013 discovery was made by a doctoral student of Professor Cedric May, professor of English at the University of Texas at Arlington, an expert on African American literature. In this new poem, Hammond no longer described slavery as the will of God, but man-made evil. According to Dr. May, the shift was a game changer in how Hammond's writing is viewed. In the poem, he is defying the idea of slavery's compatibility with Christianity.
Dark and dismal was the day when slavery began. All humble thoughts were put away. Then slaves were made by man. When shall we hear the joyful sound echo the Christian shore? Each humble voice with songs resound that slavery is no more.
Recent dialogue about this historical literature and the different viewpoints about it have brought to the fore an awareness of the two enslaved poets. That Wheatley and Hammond wrote at all against such great odds makes them worth reading today. In their work, we find an outcry against slavery despite peril. We also find the dilemma of the enslaved writer, often dependent upon their masters and upon a predominantly white readership. They admonish slavery and racism, but try to do so without offending the whites upon whom they are dependent. Nonetheless, they help to lay the foundation for the militancy of the abolitionist movement that explodes in the next century, and for the writers who would continue to bear witness against the atrocities of slavery.
Farah, thank you so much. We're going to get to the Q&A in a minute, and I expect that we are going to have some very interesting conversations. But this isn't the point in the program where if we were sitting in our lovely members room all together, I would ask you all to give a big round of applause for our presenters tonight. Thank you so much, Geoffrey D. Williams and Shontelle Thrash, for your so vividly bringing these writers to life. You're absolutely fantastic. And thank you, Dr. Griffin, for your scholarship and your insight. Wonderful to have you with us. I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of people behind the scenes who were really, truly instrumental in bringing this program to this point, and who are working very hard on our next program on the 1800s. Huge, tremendous gratitude to our New York Society Library trustee, Adrian Ingram, former library trustee, Jenny Lawrence, our events assistant, Maria Luisa Monda, and our head of events, Sarah Holliday. This is the first in our series exploring the works of African-American writers through the centuries, which will culminate in the spring in an exhibition called Black Literature Matters, which will showcase some rare books and items from our archives and special collections. And we are thrilled to have Dr. Griffin, who will be co-curating the exhibition along with our head of exhibitions, Harriet Shapiro. So we're very excited about that, and we hope we're open in the spring and you can come and actually see this in person. So I think I'm handing it over to Maria Luisa now.
This is Maria Luisa Monda, one of the library's events assistants, and I'll be reading out some questions from the audience. Dr. Griffin. Toni Morrison spoke of writing without the white gaze. Since the editors and publishers of these 1700s works were white, and at least one author dictated his narrative to a white person who created the text, how much of a white lens has been applied? Should we read their works as realistic and truthful?
Well, I think it's the way we learn to read them. That's what I loved about the various selections that we were given tonight, that we can read them recognizing that they are writing to a white audience, that they're writing to try and convince white readers of the humanity of the enslaved. And so that's the sort of writing through the white gaze, being conscious of the white gaze. And yet in each instance, we see them trying to assert a kind of authority that would have been denied them otherwise. And so we can read truth in that as well, the truth of their challenging not only slavery, but challenging anyone who would challenge their humanity. So I think it's both writing with the white gaze in mind, but also speaking as truthfully as they are able to the conditions that their fellow Black people are experiencing.
Absolutely agree. Ms. Waters, can you talk a little bit about the membership libraries that were founded in the 18th century and their role in early America?
Sure. And obviously the membership libraries that predate the public library system in the United States. And that is a purely 19th century institution. These were often started with collections of books, in the case of the New York Society Library in particular, with a group of gentlemen, clearly wealthy men in the city of New York, who came together and decided that a library would be useful to this growing city. We are not the oldest in the country. There are the Charleston Library Society predates us, the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island. And at one time, there were hundreds of membership libraries in the country. Today, there are only about 16 of us left, and mostly on the East Coast. They were places where you needed to buy a subscription. So while we say we were open to all, theoretically that's true, but you had to have a certain level of income in order to be a subscriber. But it is a testament to these institutions that several of us have survived to the current day, and are here to tell these types of stories that we're thrilled to be able to do by delving into our archives and seeing, what were early Americans reading here in New York City.
Another question is, this is fantastic. We know there were slave castles or large commercial forts on the coast of West Africa, but is there a literature of lost in African writing, or are there other cultural records of African mourning, expressive grief over those kidnapped, sold, and lost to the slave trade?
So I'm not familiar with formal narratives on that side. There are oral histories. There are sort of oral narratives that scholars have been able to collect and to cultivate. There's one book, I think it's called The Crying Time, by a scholar named Anne Bailey, an extraordinary historian, where she actually learned the language of a village and learn the oral history, to hear what those who were on the African side, who stayed in West Africa, what their recollections were, and how it formed and shaped their storytelling tradition.
It's connected, but why has it taken us this long for this country to read the voices of these Black writers?
Well, I think Carolyn will have some interesting information to share with you. I don't think it has taken this long. I think that what happens is that these get resurrected, the voices get resurrected, right? Because as we said, Equiano was very, his narrative was well known and well read and quite popular. Phyllis Wheatley, Benjamin Franklin went to visit her when she was in England, and she also wrote and corresponded with George Washington. But I think what happens is those of us who are scholars are reading it all the time, and students who take classes in African American literature are familiar with this literature. But what happens is we have moments of sort of social upheaval that call attention to what's happening in our own time, like we're dealing with right now, a kind of reckoning. And people then begin to reach for both new writers, but also old writers to better understand sort of what brings us to where we are today, so that there's a kind of resurrection of interest. But I think, as Carolyn can tell you, that in the 18th century, there were people here in New York who were interested in this literature.
Okay. And they were interested too. I mean, we know from our archives that, that they were interested in what people were reading in the UK, and they were asking for what should we be reading here in the New World. Tell us what's popular, what would a learned person read. And and we know that some of these slave narratives were first published in the UK, many more so, and so that's how these stories came to the United States, and these books came to the United States. So, and we know they were, read. We have the charging ledgers, which is very exciting for us to, to delve into that and really see how often they were read and who read them, and make some inferences about that information.
There's a question about the program. What was the genesis of this program? How did we come up with it?
Actually, Maria Luisa, you should be answering this question. You've been so instrumental in this program. I'd like you to talk about this, because you have had a wonderful experience working with this program with our trustees, Adrian and Jenny, and I'd love for you to talk about the experience of working on this project.
Oh yes, of course. I will do my best to be articulate, and so basically how the program started was after, to be frank, the brutalities that was going on in this country with the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other instances. And it was with COVID striking the country was the perfect storm, where we felt as a library, as library staff, library members, library lovers, and we felt this call to act. And I believe what happened, which feels like yesterday, but was months ago, was a meeting where we brought up a discourse on what we should do about this. And we wrote our commitment to the Black community on diversity and being exclusive, and staking our identity as libraries are for everyone, all are welcome. But it almost felt like it wasn't enough, and hence this program was born, a sense where we had to go back. Our trustee Adrian Ingram, and there was also Jenny Lawrence, as well as many others who came together to create this program. And it was the most emotional yet cathartic experience for me, and I know for many others, but I can't speak for them, of course. But that's how I would answer. I hope I answered it well. And but yes, that's how it was created.
And I think it's important for us as an institution to continually revisit our history and look and with fresh eyes as the times change. And it gives us an opportunity also to look. We've done all this great work over the years of digitizing and transcribing our first charging ledgers. We have many centuries left to do, but delving into that and seeing, we have mined that for a lot of stories over the years. What other stories are there? And we're continually discovering that, and this is new information, and I think it's really exciting. So I'm thrilled to be able to continue this, and I'm really looking forward to the 1800s and see what we're able to glean out of our archives for that program as well.
I mentioned earlier that about Harriet Jacobs, and I feel that she's a stunning addition, but there's so many voices out there that I'm looking forward to what we have in store. We have 2 more questions. One is, can you share anything you may know about the process of learning and writing English amongst the writers?
Well, I think one of the things is that, these were extraordinary individuals, right? That most of the people who came to the United States or to Britain eventually picked up English. It was by immersion, if nothing else. But the individuals who ended up writing these narratives were extraordinary individuals. They used their gifts as their intellectual gifts, their capacity to bear witness for those who did not have that kind of access. Someone like Phyllis Wheatley was a prodigy. They think she might have been 7 years old when she got here, and within 3 or 4 years, she was fluent in English. She was reading Latin. She was reading the Bible and reading the sort of Western tradition, the classics. She loved Alexander Pope. Equiano, learning, at first being very afraid, but wanting the mystery of learning how to read. There's a trope in these early writers where they call the trope of the talking book, where they see someone reading and moving their mouths and they think that person is talking to the book, and they want books to talk to them. That's how much they want access to literacy, which is a central theme in African American literature. So that, there's the day by day, one way of learning how to survive so that you become immersed in a language. And then there are these extraordinary individuals who are very gifted, who quickly learn the language through reading and through conversation. And in some instances, like Wheatley, who were being educated in the homes of the people who own them. Wheatley is being educated by the daughter of the family that owns her. And that's a common story as well.
I want to, before I read out the last question, I want to give special attention to Harriet Shapiro, our head of exhibits, who not only is coming up with a special exhibits attached to this program, but she also coined our fantastic title. So my apologies for, not that I forgot, but there was just so many people involved. But I want to give a space for her for her well-deserved tribute. Okay, our last question is actually to the performers who have done a stunning, phenomenal performance. And the question is, did you feel when you were performing, did you feel the spirits of these writers? Did you feel that were they invoked in you?
Shontelle, you can go ahead.
Well, I know Geoffrey had the majority of the reading tonight, but I could just say that it was really interesting, just really putting myself in those shoes and trying to, feel what was felt during that time, and so one of the things that I just try to do in anything that I do is to try to speak truth and to just try to step into those shoes to be able to tell that story honestly and truthfully in that moment. So So yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting when I was first approached. Well, when I first read over the narratives, because I was like, man, these some educated slaves. But in terms of the spirit of the writers, yeah, I guess you could say that. Of course, my job as the actor is to tell the truth. Kind of piggyback off of what Shontelle said. So because of the passion with which they wrote and, you know, the subject matter itself, you can't help but kind of get into the truth of that matter and just kind of live in that for a moment, if that answers your question.
We felt, saw the presence. And I just want to say, Mr. Williams, the kid is so cute. I just wanted to make that comment. But thank you so much. It was powerful, powerful readings from the both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As we conclude, is there any last thoughts and reflections from the performers or Miss Waters, Dr. Griffin? Thank you in advance.
Thank again all performers, you know, Geoffrey, Shontelle, and Farah for your participation in this program, and looking forward to the next one. This was a really special evening, and I'm so proud that the library is here to be a part of this, and that you've invited me to be a part of it. So it's been really wonderful, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I'm honored to have been a part of it. I'm looking forward to the programs that will continue throughout the centuries. This is literature that's dear to my heart. I'm very passionate, and I'm very, very happy to be doing this kind of programming with you all at the library.
Well, in our next program on the 1800s, new generations of African American writers born into slavery and freedom came forth in increasing numbers. They were influencing readers and creating the basis of the Black literary canon. So in putting together this program, we have drawn extensively from the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, 3rd edition, edited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Valerie A. Smith. We are grateful to the editors for their insightful commentary. Most of all, however, we are indebted to these Black writers. They've created an enduring and inclusive body of work that has grown and flourished over the past 320 years. Thanks to all of you for attending this program. We hope you will join us again, either in person or online. The library is open. We do have a current exhibition up. People can come in small numbers, but that will be coming down at the end of the year, so we can make plans for the next exhibition, Black Literature Matters. And we hope you will join us for the program in the 1800s that's coming in January. Thank you again.